The motorcycle engines roared like thunder, echoing through the small town streets as heads turned to witness a sight no one expected. Dozens of riders, clad in leather and steel, lined up side by side in a living wall of chrome and power. But they weren't there to intimidate, nor to parade for attention. They had come with a mission. At the center of this formation was a young girl, her eyes filled with both fear and hope, clutching onto the promise of escape from a life that had crushed her spirit for far too long. This was not just an escort. It was a rescue. For years, she had endured silence within the walls of her own home, where love should have existed but cruelty had taken root. No one saw the bruises hidden beneath long sleeves. No one heard the muffled sobs swallowed by the night. But whispers eventually escaped, and they reached the ears of people who would not stand by idly. These riders, men and women bound not by blood but by loyalty, decided to act. They were strangers to her, yet in that moment, they became her shield, her guardians, her unexpected saviors. The sight was breathtaking. Engines hummed in unison, their presence sending a message louder than words. She is not alone anymore. Every rev of the throttle drowned out the echoes of her suffering. The air carried an energy that made bystanders hold their breath, as if history was being rewritten before their eyes. This was a declaration that cruelty would no longer have the final word, that fear would no longer dictate her future. Inside her heart, fear wrestled with disbelief. Could it be real? Could complete strangers rise for her, when those closest to her had only caused pain? Tears welled in her eyes as she realized the truth. The world was bigger than her cage, and compassion could come from the most unexpected places. For the first time in years, she felt the weight of chains lifting, replaced by the steady rumble of engines carrying her toward freedom. That night, the story of the girl and her wall of guardians would spread far beyond that small town. It would become a tale not of violence, but of courage. A tale that reminded the world that sometimes it takes the unity of strangers to break the silence of suffering. And for the girl who once believed escape was impossible, the road ahead had finally opened, bright, wide, and lined with hope. The girl sat in the back seat of a modest car, her hands trembling as she watched the riders gather around her. Their presence was overwhelming, their engines rumbling like a heartbeat that reassured her she was no longer invisible. For so long, she had been silenced, trapped in a home that was supposed to protect her, but instead became her prison. Yet here she was, surrounded by strangers who treated her pain as their own, standing tall in a way her own family never did. Each rider carried the scars of their own battles, but tonight they carried her. As the convoy moved forward, the sight drew gasps from neighbors who stepped out of their homes, unable to ignore the spectacle. People whispered, some with disbelief, others with awe, as the line of motorcycles stretched down the street like a river of steel. The girl's story, once hidden behind closed doors, was now written across the faces of those who chose to protect her. This was more than an escort. It was a public declaration that her suffering had been seen and that justice, in some form, had finally arrived. Inside the car, she pressed her forehead against the glass, the vibration of engines rattling through her bones. She thought of nights spent crying into her pillow, of mornings when she wished the day would never come. Every memory cut deep, but with every mile, those memories seemed to lose their grip. The sound of motorcycles was louder than the silence she had endured for years. It was a sound that said, "We believe you, and you are worth saving." The riders knew the road ahead would not be easy. They had seen enough of life to understand that pain doesn't disappear overnight, and healing is not immediate. But they also knew that sometimes the first step is the most powerful, the moment someone realizes they don't have to face their darkness alone. Each rider was determined to be part of that first step, to create a memory that would forever replace at least part of her pain with hope. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, the convoy became something almost sacred. It was not about noise or power, but about presence, the undeniable presence of compassion made visible. For the girl, every turn of the wheels was a promise that life would no longer be defined by fear, but by the people willing to stand beside her. The further they rode, the more powerful the sight became. At intersections, Cars pulled over, and drivers leaned out of their windows, watching silently as the convoy passed. Some honked in support, others waved, and a few even shed tears at the sight of so many strangers uniting for one fragile life. The riders didn't need to explain their mission. Their presence alone told the story. Everyone who saw it understood. This was what protection looked like, raw and unfiltered. The girl began to realize something profound. Her life mattered, even when she had been convinced it did not. She looked at the sea of helmets and leather jackets surrounding her, each one representing a choice to stand with her rather than against her. It was a kind of love she had never experienced, one that did not demand anything in return, one that did not seek to control, but to empower. For the first time, she felt worthy of care. Behind the helmets, the riders carried their own histories: addiction, loss, broken homes, battles with loneliness. Each one knew what it was like to be dismissed, to be invisible, to feel powerless. And that was why they rode with such conviction. Protecting her was not charity, it was solidarity. They saw themselves in her fear, and they wanted to prove to her that no matter how deep the scars, survival was possible. The road stretched ahead like a symbol of her new beginning. Every mile added distance between her and the house where her voice had been silenced. Every roar of the engines was a reminder that she was now part of a community that would not let her fall. Her heart still ached. Her body still remembered the weight of abuse. But hope was slowly beginning to take root in its place. As darkness settled, the convoy switched on their headlights, creating a river of light in the night. From above, it looked like a protective chain, each beam linking to the next. The symbolism was undeniable. She was no longer a solitary figure in the shadows, but someone being carried towards safety by the strength of many. And though the night was far from over, for the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe in tomorrow. By the time the convoy reached the edge of town, the girl could feel the weight of her past slowly slipping away. She watched as more riders joined along the route, answering the call when they heard what was happening. What began as dozens soon became more, a wave of humanity on two wheels, their headlights piercing through the darkness like stars guiding her to freedom. Each addition to the group was another voice declaring, "You are not alone, and you will never be alone again." The girl's mind wandered back to the nights when she thought no one cared, when her pain seemed invisible. Now, the streets told a different story. People stepped out of restaurants, shops, and gas stations to record the passing convoy on their phones. But even more powerful than the cameras were the tears in their eyes. They weren't just watching a procession. They were witnessing a miracle of compassion. In that moment, the girl's story became larger than herself. It became a testament to the strength of collective kindness. Inside the safety of the convoy, she dared to take a deep breath, the first real one in years. It was shaky, filled with both grief and relief, but it was real. Her chest rose and fell, as if reminding her lungs that they were made to breathe freely. She realized she had been waiting her entire life for this, the moment when fear no longer held her hostage. Every mile forward was a mile away from silence, away from despair. The riders noticed her face through the car window, illuminated by the glow of passing streetlights. They didn't need to hear her words to understand what she was feeling. They knew that look, hope mixed with disbelief, fear mingled with gratitude. It was the same look many of them once wore when someone, somewhere, had stood up for them. And it was why they were here now, paying forward what had once been given to them. When the convoy reached the open highway, the rumble of engines harmonized into something that felt larger than life. The girl closed her eyes and let the sound surround her, drowning out every cruel word ever spoken to her, every painful memory etched into her heart. For the first time, the noise wasn't frightening. It was liberating. It was the sound of freedom, carrying her away from her past and into the unknown, where healing waited. The journey stretched long into the night, but the riders never wavered. They rode in formation, as though each one was a link in an unbreakable chain. The girl's fear began to fade into something she hadn't dared to feel in years: trust. Trust that the people around her wouldn't turn on her. Trust that she was worth the effort. Trust that strangers could love her enough to protect her fiercely. That trust, fragile but growing, was the seed of her new beginning. in towns along the route. The convoy became a living story passed from mouth to mouth. Shopkeepers locked their doors just to step outside and watch. Families gathered on porches, and children pointed wide-eyed at the sea of riders. Some people cheered, some stood in stunned silence, but all of them felt the same truth. This was more than a ride. It was a declaration that kindness, when multiplied, can change the course of a single life forever. The girl pressed her hand to the window, palm flat against the glass, as though reaching for the protection surrounding her. A tear slipped down her cheek, but this time it wasn't from pain. It was from wonder. She realized that she was no longer running away. She was moving towards something better. And for the first time, she began to imagine a future where she wasn't defined by fear, but by the courage of those who had chosen to stand with her. Among the riders, there was no need for words. They communicated through gestures, through the steady rhythm of their bikes, through the silent promise that they would not leave her side. Each turn of the wheel was a vow to keep her safe. Each mile covered was proof that healing doesn't always begin with therapy or medicine, but with presence, simply knowing someone cares enough to stay. As the night deepened, the convoy approached its destination, a safe house where the girl could finally rest. The engine slowed, headlights cutting gently through the darkness. The riders surrounded her car one final time, their formation tight, their message clear: "We brought you here, and you are safe." She exhaled, her body trembling with the release of years of tension. For the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of what came next. When the car finally stopped, the riders dismounted one by one, forming a protective wall around the girl as she stepped out. The night air was cool against her skin, carrying the scent of gasoline and leather, but also something far more powerful: safety. She looked around at the faces hidden beneath helmets, some lined with age, others still youthful, all united by the same silent vow. For a girl who had spent her life surrounded by fear, this moment was overwhelming. It was proof that she mattered, and that she was worth fighting for. The safe house stood quietly at the edge of the town, its lights glowing warmly through the windows. Volunteers waited at the door, ready to welcome her into a place where cruelty could not reach. But before she entered, she turned back to the convoy, her eyes wide and wet with tears. She wanted to say something, to thank them for what they had done, but no words could capture the depth of what she felt. All she could manage was a trembling smile, one that carried more gratitude than any speech ever could. The riders responded not with words, but with the revving of their engines, a roar that echoed into the night sky. It wasn't noise, it was a promise that even if she stumbled, even if fear tried to claw its way back into her life, she would never again have to face it alone. The sound reverberated through her chest, replacing every cruel memory with a thunder of protection. It was a symphony of defiance against the past that once caged her. She walked toward the door of the safe house, each step heavy with the weight of her past, but lighter with the hope of her future. The riders stood their ground, watching as she crossed the threshold, ensuring she made it safely inside. In that moment, the line between strangers and family blurred, because family is not always blood. It is the people who choose to stand by you when no one else will. As the door closed gently behind her, the riders lingered in silence, their engines still rumbling. For them, this was not just about one girl. It was about every survivor who needed proof that the world still held goodness. They had escorted her to safety, but in truth, they had done something even greater. They had rewritten her story from one of despair to one of resilience, from isolation to belonging. Inside the safe house, the girl was greeted with kindness, so unfamiliar it nearly unraveled her. Warm blankets were draped over her shoulders, gentle hands offered food and water, and voices whispered assurances that she was safe now. She sat on the edge of a couch, her body tense, unsure if she could believe it. But as minutes turned into hours, the fear began to loosen its grip. For the first time, she allowed herself to close her eyes without bracing for violence. Sleep came softly, wrapped not in silence, but in the faint hum of motorcycles still waiting outside. The riders refused to leave immediately. They parked their bikes in formation, taking shifts to ensure the safe house remained protected through the night. Some leaned against their handlebars, Others sat cross-legged on the pavement, but all of them remained vigilant. They knew healing takes time, and though their engines could not mend scars, their presence could remind her that strength still stood guard outside her door. As dawn painted the horizon with shades of orange and gold, the riders prepared to depart. They did not knock, did not demand recognition. They simply rode off quietly, leaving behind the memory of thunder in the night. They knew she would remember the sound, that it would forever echo in her heart as the night strangers became her shield. Their mission was complete, but its impact was eternal. The girl awoke to find the house quiet, sunlight streaming across the floorboards. For a moment, she wondered if the ride had been a dream, if her mind had conjured a fantasy too beautiful to be real. But when she stepped outside, she saw the tire tracks etched into the dirt road, proof that the convoy had indeed been there, proof that her story had changed forever. She touched the marks with trembling fingers, as if grounding herself in the truth of her new reality. Her journey of healing was only beginning, but she no longer faced it alone. She carried with her the memory of dozens of riders who had answered a call for help, the sound of engines that had drowned out her silence, and the realization that compassion could come from unexpected places. What they gave her was not just an escape. It was a new beginning, a chance to write a life where fear was no longer the author. The girl's life inside the safe house began with quiet mornings filled with the smell of fresh coffee and the sound of laughter for volunteers. At first, it felt foreign, like stepping into a world she wasn't sure she deserved. But slowly, she allowed herself to trust the warmth that surrounded her. Each day brought small victories, a genuine smile, a night of uninterrupted sleep, a meal shared without fear. The echoes of engines from that night still lingered in her memory, reminding her that strangers had chosen to fight for her when she couldn't fight for herself. The riders, though they had returned to their own lives, kept her close in spirit. They sent messages through the safe house staff, letting her know she was still in their thoughts. To them, the mission hadn't ended when she crossed the threshold. It had only begun. Their support was not a fleeting gesture. It was a bond. And though she didn't see their faces every day, she carried their strength like armor, shielding her from the shadows of her past. For the community, the convoy became a legend. Photos and videos spread across social media, touching hearts far beyond the town's borders. People shared the story with captions like "This is what humanity should look like," and "Compassion in motion." Strangers reached out with offers to help other survivors, inspired by the sight of dozens of riders standing against cruelty. The girl's escape was no longer just her story. It had become a movement of empathy, proof that even the darkest battles could be met with overwhelming light. Inside her, the transformation was slow but undeniable. The fear that once dictated her every move was replaced by cautious hope. She began to dream, not of escape, but of possibility. Possibility of school without shame, of friendships without secrets, of a future where her worth wasn't defined by the hands that had hurt her, but by the love of those who chose to protect her. Each dream was fragile, yet it was more than she had ever dared to hold before. And through it all, the roar of motorcycles never left her mind. It became her reminder, her anthem of resilience. Whenever doubt crept back, she would close her eyes and hear the thunder of engines rolling beside her, a wall of guardians promising she would never again walk through life alone. That sound, once terrifying, was now the heartbeat of her healing. As weeks turned into months, the girl grew stronger. She began journaling, pouring her memories onto paper, not as wounds but as proof of her survival. Each entry ended with a simple line, "I am not alone." The riders had given her more than one night of protection. They had given her a mantra to carry forward, a truth that no abuser could ever erase. Her words, raw and trembling, became a story of hope that even she didn't realize would inspire others one day. The riders reunited occasionally, gathering at local diners or roadside stops. And when they spoke of that night, their voices carried reverence. For many of them, it was a reminder of why they rode. Not for the thrill of the road, but for the bonds of brotherhood and sisterhood that had given them meaning. Protecting her had reminded them that their strength wasn't just mechanical, it was human. They had become part of something larger than themselves, and they carried that pride like a hidden medal. The girl eventually returned to school, her steps hesitant at first, her eyes searching the halls for judgment. But instead of whispers and shame, she found kindness. News of her story had reached her peers, and instead of isolating her, it drew people closer. Teachers looked at her with new respect, classmates offered friendship, and the walls that once felt suffocating became spaces where she could finally breathe. For the first time, school felt like a beginning, not a burden. Her healing did not erase the scars of the past, but it reshaped them. Each scar became a reminder of what she had survived, of a night when strangers chose to ride for her. She no longer saw herself as broken, but as rising, like the engines that once lit the night with thunder. She began to believe that her story mattered, not just for her, but for every other child still trapped in silence. And so, the girl who had once hidden her pain in shadows stood taller each day, her voice steady, her heart stronger. She had been escorted to freedom, but she had also been escorted into a new identity: survivor, dreamer, fighter. The convoy was gone, but its impact lived in every breath she took, every step she dared to make into the future. The riders had given her more than protection. They had given her the courage to live. The seasons began to change, and with them, so did the girl. Where once she carried herself with her shoulders hunched and her eyes downcast, she now walked with quiet determination. The town noticed. People who had seen her escorted by the riders would nod at her in the streets, some offering words of encouragement, others simply smiling with silent respect. She was no longer the girl trapped in silence. She was the girl who had been carried to freedom by a wall of steel and compassion. Her story had given the community a new lens through which to see courage. The riders kept watch from distance. They didn't shadow her every step, but they never let her forget she had allies. Birthdays came with a roar of motorcycles outside her safe house, their engines rumbling like a chorus of support. Holidays brought handwritten cards, each one reminding her that family can be chosen, and sometimes the strongest bonds are formed not by blood, but by sacrifice. These gestures wove themselves in her healing, thread by thread, until she began to feel whole again. The girl also started sharing her story in small ways. First in whispers to trusted friends, then in classrooms where counselors invited her to speak, and eventually at community gatherings where survivors stood together to be heard. Her voice, once stolen, became powerful, trembling at times, but unstoppable. She told people not only of her pain, but of the night when strangers showed her that kindness could be louder than cruelty. Each telling was both a release and a gift to others still trapped in shadows. The banker, the abuser, the ghosts of her past, they no longer held power over her. What once defined her was now just a chapter in a much larger book, one that was still being written. And though she carried scars, she wore them with pride, as proof of survival. They were not marks of weakness, but of strength, reminders that she had been broken but never destroyed. Her story was now a story of rising. And in the quiet of her nights, when the weight of memory pressed down, she would still close her eyes and hear it, the steady rumble of engines. That sound had become her lullaby, her shield, her reminder that even in the darkest places, light could arrive in the form of roaring steel and open hearts. It was not just the sound of motorcycles, it was the sound of hope. Years later, the girl would look back on that night not as an ending, but as the beginning of her life. The image of dozens of riders escorting her into freedom never faded, etched in her memory like a painting too vivid to forget. Whenever doubt crept in, she drew strength from that vision, a wall of guardians standing between her and the world that had once broken her. It was proof that humanity, at its best, could be breathtakingly beautiful. Her life blossomed in directions she never imagined possible. She pursued studies, made lasting friendships, and built a future where her choices were her own. Every success she achieved felt intertwined with that convoy, because without it, she might never have dared to believe she was worthy of more. Their ride had not only taken her away from abuse, it had propelled her toward a destiny filled with possibility. The riders, too, never forgot her. Over time, their numbers changed. New faces joined, old friends moved on, But whenever they gathered, her story remained a part of their brotherhood and sisterhood. It was a reminder of why they rode, why they stayed united, why compassion was their greatest strength. She was their proof that one act of courage could ripple outward, touching countless lives. Communities across the country began to model themselves after that ride, creating networks of guardians willing to show up for those in need. What started as one convoy for one girl became a movement that spread far beyond the borders of her town. The story became legend, a testament to the fact that when ordinary people rise together, extraordinary change is possible. And so the girl's journey, born in pain, was transformed into a legacy of hope. She had once believed her life would be defined by fear, but instead, it became defined by resilience, by kindness, and by the thunder of dozens of engines that carried her into freedom. She was no longer just a survivor. She was living proof that compassion, when multiplied, can rewrite even the darkest story into one of light. There are stories that move us for a moment, and then there are stories that stay with us forever. The night dozens of riders escorted a frightened girl away from her abusive home is not just a tale of escape. It is a reminder of what humanity is capable of when compassion outweighs indifference. It proves that courage is not always about standing alone. Sometimes it is about standing together so powerfully that darkness has no choice but to retreat. This journey showed us that healing does not begin when the past disappears. It begins when someone steps forward to say, "You are not alone." For the girl, that thunder of engines became the heartbeat of her new life. Proof that even in the most painful silence, voices will rise to protect and defend. It is a lesson for all of us. The smallest act of solidarity can become the spark that saves someone from despair. We are left with a powerful truth. Cruelty isolates, but compassion unites. Those riders may never have imagined the depth of their impact, yet their choice to show up reshaped not only the life of one girl, but the very fabric of the community. And if dozens of strangers could change her story, what might happen if we, in our own lives, chose to do the same for those around us? The question lingers, are we bystanders, or are we protectors? Think of the world we would live in if kindness became our instinct instead of judgment, if standing up for others became as natural as breathing. That convoy was more than motorcycles on a road. It was a living declaration that empathy can be louder than fear, that even broken stories can be rewritten with hope. The lesson is clear. When we choose to rise for others, we create ripples of change that stretch far beyond what our eyes can see. If this story touched you, take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments, because your words may inspire someone else who needs courage today. Subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next story that challenges and uplifts, and leave a like to help this message reach more hearts. After all, stories like these are not just meant to be heard. They are meant to be lived, remembered, and carried forward.